Let's continue to break down why we had so much wind damage. I think a lot of it has to do with what's called a wake low.
Yeah.
You mentioned that a little earlier this morning in our 5 o'clock hour. You mentioned, we could go into the science. Let's dive deep into the science.
Yeah.
What is a wake low? Why was that so impactful?
It was a hot topic on social media yesterday. Meteorologist Colton Woods and I were kind of geeking out about it behind the scenes before the damage, right? Oh my gosh, we remember learning about this in college. We haven't had to talk about it or think about it in so long. And so I think the simplest way I can put it is it was a decaying line of thunderstorms. So when I say that, these were thunderstorms that were no longer holding on to their strength and their umph. And they were entering into a really warm atmosphere, right? We had temperatures sitting in the 70s. But as those rain showers came down and the thunderstorms began to weaken, we had an area or a pocket of rain-cooled air. And so that actually created high pressure at the surface. But behind those thunderstorms, because they were decaying, there was a lot of sinking air. And so with warm air aloft, that air begins to sink, and we see a low pressure system follow that high pressure system on the backside of the system. And so, those are a lot of words there, but one thing that I can tell you is that when you have a high pressure juxtaposed next to a low pressure system, that gradient gets tight. What does that mean? That means that the pressure or the lines in our pressure are really close together, and that creates strong surface winds. And so that's a whole lot of science there. Right there could have been a picture that I drew on an exam, right, in boundary layer meteorology. But all that being said, we saw this locally dense wind. And then Tanner, it's as important to mention that, yes, this was a line of wind, as Consumers Energy mentioned, and so that creates more issues. The wind direction in general, I think, had a huge role in what occurred at the surface, right? Typically, we see a westerly wind. In fact, this front approached from the west, but because of the setup within this wake low, the winds were driving in out of the south and east.
Yeah.
And so winds were being hit in a direction that they typically don't impact trees at the surface from. We also had waterlogged trees. We've had so much rainfall, as we know, and those trees became vulnerable. And then again, we came off of a really harsh winter season. So you start to add up all the different variables, and it begins to make some sense why we saw the vast extent of wind damage that we did.
Yeah, I think people can draw 2 and 2 together as to how all of those factors do impact our trees and impact maybe some of the ground around some of our power lines and power poles as well.
Yeah.
But just to give people an idea, how does multiple rounds of rain, melting runoff from our ice that we had over the winter, not only that, the snow that we had from the winter, how does all of that contribute to pushing over trees like we saw yesterday?
Yeah, I mean, I want you to think about, let's pretend you were going to pull a flower out of the ground, right? Or a weed, pulling it out of the ground. Think about it in terms of the summer. After kind of a damp stretch, you go to pull that weed out, it's really easy, right?
Yeah.
The soil's moist, the roots come right out, and it's an easy job. If it has just been this long, prolonged, dry stretch of weather, and the roots are deep into the ground, and there's just this hard, compact soil on top of it, you might be really digging the roots of that weed out. Trees work the same exact way. And so we have this abundant amount of moisture in our ground right now, and that's causing the roots to weaken. It's potentially reaching up into the stems or the trunks of these trees and destabilizing them. I'm no
kind of
arborist.
Like what we saw here.
Yeah, you can see even just the cracks in the ground there surrounding the roots. But yeah, I'm not an arborist, so I'm probably not speaking to it perfectly. If they're listening to me right now, they're like, okay, she kind of knows what she's talking about. But I will say, if you just think about it in the general terms of pulling a weed or pulling a flower out of the ground, when the soil's a little bit moister, it's easier to do that. And this is kind of a big scale of that.
Okay, well, I think that's a really good explainer, just to kind of give people a picture of why we saw so much tree and wind damage over the last couple of days. Again,